If there's one thing that gets me interested in a game above all else, it would have to be interesting movement mechanics. There's something about the rush of moving fast in a cool way, as well as the time it takes to master it. My favorite example being the heavily physics-influenced movement in Team Fortress 2. You have bullet surfing to avoid damage, glitching out physics on corners to go flying, but most importantly, the soldier's ability to rocket jump. It's a complex game of mangling this physics engine to its very core in order to turn the second slowest class in the game into the single most mobile one. And my love for rocket jumping led me to this one revelation. It was 5 in the morning and I haven't been able to sleep a lick in days, so I decided to load up an Ocarina of Time map just to practice rocket jumping in, which, a quick shout out, that map is actually insane because it is literally all of Ocarina of Time minus the dungeons. It's actually fucking huge. But this map made me want something I never knew till now. What if there was just a movement-focused sandbox game? I definitely prefer it if it had rocket jumping style movement, but I'd absolutely love any kind of sandbox with a focus on going fast over a huge landscape. Hover had me interested because of that, and while it was very good in that regard, that's the only thing it did well. So, cut to me getting my hands on VR, and my friend suggests a little litmus test for how well I can handle my VR sickness. This game is called Jet Island. The moment I looked it up, regardless of this silly little challenge you gave me, I was instantly hooked into the idea. A huge sandbox where the entire thing is set up to facilitate going insanely fast from abusing physics with jet boosters and grappling hooks? Sign me the fuck up. After finishing this game, I came to the conclusion that it's a little rough around the edges, but ultimately was incredible, and in essence, it was just Tribes meets Shadow of the Colossus. By rough around the edges, I mostly mean that the game kind of bordered on being a tech demo, where there's really only 2 enemies to encounter outside of the 5 bosses, and those 2 enemies are pretty much the same except one is harder than the other. Then there's the world, which I can only describe as flying around the map and clicking every button in the props tab of Gary's mod. There's random obstacles, ramps, and other things to try and skate off of in pretty much every square inch of the map, with little rhyme or reason other than, here's a cool physics thing to try and practice. There are a number of more structured ideas, like some of the bridges between areas, and obstacle courses to reach each boss, and sort of things like that. But the rest, it just seems like a huge mess of ideas to facilitate putting some form of ramp in every part of this area. So I should probably go over what tools you have to traverse this surprisingly expansive world. First up is your hoverboard, which isn't necessarily a tool, but it's just a way to not have your no friction mode be a button. You'll almost always have this on, but there are a few moments here and there where a little bit of precision helps, since hitting any surface without it will cause you to lose all your momentum almost instantly. The next tool is your primary form of movement, the rocket boosters. These are mounted to both your wrists, so they're aimed with your hands. Since both are independent from one another, you can point them in all different directions to influence how you want to move. Though generally doing that won't affect much since changing your momentum at high speeds takes so much time, and you're always perfectly stable, so you might as well just go full force in one direction. These are basically just meant to add speed to your character and change your momentum slightly. The real game changer is with the next tool. This one is the cherry on this physics-based cake. Jetstream Island's primary gimmick for actually maneuvering through everything is a pair of grappling hooks in each hand. There really isn't much to say about these because they function exactly like you'd imagine a pivot works, but that plain simplicity is where you can do some really fun tricks, especially since you have one on each arm. They allow you to turn on a dime by shooting it onto the floor off to your side. You can use both at once in opposite directions to slow down, or you can even alternate between hooks to climb ceilings. The last tool to aid you in your quest to become the fastest man alive is your blaster. At first, you might just see this as a weapon to shoot weak spots, but it actually provides a nice new avenue for gaining huge speed. You pretty much just rocket jump with this thing. Fully emptying your boosters up a hill and shooting the ground once you reach the top is a surefire way to get some insane airtime. It's also not just the explosion that pushes you, just the force of shooting it will move you a bit, which becomes somewhat important for bosses, since they generally have some pretty good tracking if you have nothing to grab onto or no fuel to change your speed with. This gun is always ready and lets you move out of the way from these blasts. And those are all the tools you get. Once you're shown what they do, you're just thrown into this huge world and expected to explore. The game doesn't really tell you much, other than that there's a few big bosses you need to kill, and that's pretty much it. That's one thing I really like about Jet Set Island. Exploration is actually quite fun due to the unique style of all the various areas. It might be an absolute mess of ideas, but every area is kind of its own unique mess. There's one island over here that's just a massive spiral of boosters leading up to a pit full of spikes. This other area is just full of huge hills and valleys overlooked by all this tall rubble you can fling yourself off of. Oh, and don't forget the giant hollow ball you can enter for a sick enemy encounter inside of it. It doesn't just end at the stuff you find along the surface, there's actually an entire section under the map itself hanging over the open abyss. You'd only discover this if you decided to just throw yourself off the edge of the map like I did. That, or you glitched through the terrain. Again. Yeah, this game runs flawlessly about 90% of the time and never really crashed on me. But that last percent is just hilariously catastrophic glitches, like phasing through the world, or straight up skipping a boss fight by being able to go through its force field and attacking its core. But admittedly, as fun as it is to traverse this world, there's not a whole lot to really do. The vast majority of it is just finding cool stuff to ramp off of and just look for upgrades and collectibles. Upgrades are gotten from beating these drones that are placed around the map that are overall pretty easy to spot from a distance. These enemies are unfortunately pretty simple. It's just a drone that slowly levitates around, fires a singular shot every now and again, and that's pretty much it. And the cannons don't even kill you, they just push you very far away and detach your grappling hook, so unless there's water nearby, you could just grapple onto the floor and immediately turn right back to the action. And on top of that, most of them move so slow that you can straight up just land on top of it, grapple onto it so it can't shake you off, and blast away. It only takes 2 shots to kill them. So after you defeat them, they'll drop an upgrade, which doesn't feel too impactful admittedly. The only ones you'll really notice right out of the gate is hookshot length and your jet booster capacity. Everything else just helps you gain or maintain momentum better, which is really hard to notice because of how extremely gradual that is. Outside of those drones, the only other thing to do is go for the collectibles, which aren't really super tough to find either since they make a pretty loud noise from quite a distance away, and few collectibles are really that well hidden. Some might require you to find a specific hole that will lead you pretty far away, but others are kinda just hidden in some corner of a random piece of ruin. But with that said, any excuse to motivate me to keep ramping off every object I can find is more than enough for me. So, before I talk about the bosses, I do have to mention these collectibles. These are modifiers that you're only allowed one of and alter something either huge or incredibly minor about the game. Some completely change the rules, like making the entire world upside down or disabling your jetpack. Others are cosmetics, like changing the time of day. But there's one specifically I want to mention, and it was kind of the whole reason my friend recommended this game to me. Extreme Spin Mode. I will try my best to make a case for why I feel this is a genuinely phenomenal feature if you have the capacity to deal with it. This game, as is, can make the more VR sensitive people have a run for their money. But Extreme Spin Mode will make Jet Island Can't Melt Steel Beams into a vomit-inducing mess that has genuinely ruined this game for me by being such a fun and satisfying way to play it, since it doesn't even faze me in the slightest. As a warning, since I've seen some people have trouble watching footage of this mode, I will be using footage of Extreme Spin Mode for the rest of this video. In this mode, your camera is not stabilized and is influenced by momentum a lot more. Normally, your character is always level, and you will look in one direction unless you move your head yourself, even if momentum dictates that you should be spinning around like a madman. But with Extreme Spin Mode, even your jet boosters, if used wrong, will cause you to start tipping over. This game changes from a fun, grappling hook sandbox game to a physics-based nightmare where you're trying to manipulate momentum in your favor in order to get a proper orientation on whatever you're trying to accomplish. And while it sounds like it might be a hassle, and I'll admit it kind of is, in some instances it actually makes things a bit easier, or almost like that's how the game was meant to be played in some places. And I'm not sitting here trying to be pretentious that my way of playing is better, but there are a few moments that just don't work well without it. Look at these two clips for comparison. At the end of a boss, you get launched up this vertical tunnel through tons of booster pads. Without spin mode, you have to constantly look up, and even then you barely see anything but the floor. Now here's what it looks like with extreme spin mode, because it makes your hoverboard and thus your camera turn these vertical walls into the new floor, and it looks so much cooler. Another instance is this boss fight in the ball. It gets really weird when you get high up on these walls, so the fight feels more like a giant half pipe. But when you play with extreme spin mode, it becomes this mind-melting fight where you're just zipping past the boss from every angle. But it's nowhere near perfect, and you pretty much have to change the way you play the game in order to accommodate some jank. You can't really use your boosters while grappled unless you use both hooks, or else you'll lose your lunch. So you have to make sure you build momentum and then grapple. The blaster doesn't really move the camera, so you will be using this a lot more. It also really hates enclosed spaces, since it constantly tries to recenter you to the new floor. You also admittedly lose a lot of precision since you're fiddling around with momentum a lot more. Bosses that would take me maybe 10-15 minutes to do without this mode kinda took me like 30 minutes to an hour. Granted, I personally had way more fun, but that is a lot of extra fiddling you have to do. Probably the biggest problem is that having any modifier at all, even the dumb cosmetic ones, disables saving and collectibles, so I pretty much played this game twice over at the exact same time. So that long-winded section was just my warning that from this point on, I will be occasionally showing footage of extreme spin mode, since I do think that it can really convey the extra spectacle that can be had when fighting these bosses. And boy, these fucking bosses. That's definitely where a lot of this game's enjoyment comes from, I'd say. When you're not going after these bosses, you're really just dicking around on the surface for the hell of it. As I mentioned, there are 5 bosses in total, although only 4 if you don't count the basic tutorial boss. 3 are located deep underground with the entrances marked by these towers, and the 4th is always visible from the surface as it flies around protected by the other 3 bosses. When you reach the shield towers, there's usually some long obstacle course that you have to get through in order to get to the boss itself. Each boss is located in their own unique and massive environment for you to have to traverse and slowly take them down. The goal is pretty much the same as the drones that you fought earlier. You have to shoot at the central core that's inside all of these creatures in order to defeat them. However, unlike the drones, they usually have a force field protecting their insides, so you have to take out various crystals across their body to get inside. This can be easier said than done, since these areas are massive, the bosses are constantly moving around, and occasionally shooting at you, so lining up the perfect shot can get a little tricky at times. Overall, I fucking love the sheer scale of these bosses and arenas. The standout for me has to be this giant arboreum where the boss is a huge lizard climbing around this tree. Just getting up there with all the turrets floating around can take time, but climbing that tree felt so damn good. The crystals on this boss are located inside its mouth and all the way at the end of this tail, so you have your work cut out for you there. Admittedly, it is pretty simple and not a whole lot happens during these fights, but just the act of interacting with the physics to take down these behemoths is so satisfying. And that's pretty much the main crux of my enjoyment of this game. It's not necessarily super deep or, ultimately engaging, but it's just so gratifying to be grappling across these huge bosses and environments, aided by the sheer perspective given to you by VR. And the music accompanying these fights is kind of a surprise too. It definitely feels somewhat inspired by Shadow of the Colossus in that regard, and it's pretty solid. However, I personally felt like the whole nature of this game, being this dumb high-speed physics game where you fling yourself at gargantuan monsters, it just felt like it needed a more cheesy and rockin' soundtrack to be more appropriate. If I might make a suggestion for something you could play, I unironically loved listening to the vocal tracks from the 3D Sonic games along with this game. They somehow just fit so well, and here's a quick taste to see what I mean. Admittedly, I personally preferred the Little V metal covers, so that's what I'll be showing off. So once you got all those early bosses down, you can take on the final boss, whose name, and I shit you not here, is Wormy. This boss can be fought immediately once all the other bosses are dead, since they tend to rocket you up into the sky, allowing you to grab onto him if he's nearby. But if you don't catch up to him, then he flies all the way up to the floating islands that have been above you this whole time. This is a little tricky to get to, and kind of requires you to have enough upgrades to even reach it, since it's very high up. It's also your last chance to get a few extra upgrades, and I'd recommend it too, since this place is extremely spread apart, and any failure will result in a 30-second long fall before you can even try again. Once you reach the highest point, you can then launch yourself off the various boost pads and take on the boss. Admittedly, this can also be very annoying because if you fail, not only do you have to fall for a while, but depending on where Wormy is, it can take another 30 seconds to even reach him because you're effectively flying across the entire world map just to reach him. But past that, this fight is incredible. You spend the entire time just traversing along his body parts until you find a few ports to enter which allow you to go through small obstacle courses in order to destroy the cores and remove the force field in front of his mouth. Once that's taken care of, you fly right into the spiked death trap on his face to deal the final blow. The ending is amazing too. Like the other bosses, you just fall out of whatever hole you crawled in and watch them fall to the ground. But with Wormy, he just comes apart piece by piece as they land everywhere across this world. Beating him also grants a special upgrade which allows you to see all the collectibles marked on the map, which allows you to 100% this game much easier. The last thing I gotta praise is the aesthetics. I don't know what it is about VR allowing menus that would otherwise look super shit by today's standards kind of look amazing with the right presentation. I never thought a 3D PlayStation 1 UI would hit just right for me, but here we are. My absolute favorite detail is that you can activate it by pressing the button under your wrist in-game, and while staring at the menu or map, you could just turn over your hand and it'll turn off the menu. So that concludes everything I had to say about Little St. Jet Island. It may border on being a tech demo, but honestly, that adds to this game's charm. From the aesthetic, the way the level is just a bunch of props strewn around the place, and the huge spectacle of these bootleg mechanical bosses, it really helps it stand out more in my mind. Hell, I actually finished playing this game almost 2 months ago without touching it since, and I still remember everything about my playthrough and the fun I had, on top of everything I wanted to say about it when writing the script. This game was such a blast and was close to being a game that I've always wanted. Maybe next time the developer, Master Indie, will hit an even harder home run in my eyes. He actually has announced his next game and mentioned that it will be quite similar to this game, so I hope to God that it's been greatly improved.